So I'm Daphne Hoffacker, the ACPTA Advocacy Chair. My job is to encourage participation in our democratic process and to get every parent and teacher and community member in the Austin area aware of the issues, understanding the part that they play in it, understanding the impacts of the policy decisions that have been made regarding education in Texas, the impacts on our teachers and our students and our families. We're going to start this year-long discussion leading into the legislative session in the spring by talking about school funding, because school funding is the very beating heart of the issues that we're facing in our public education system right now. We are not fully funded. We are not even close, and it impacts school class sizes, it impacts services, it impacts the stress we feel as parents because our students are not getting enough support in their schools. So I am going to introduce you to Laura Yeager from Just Fund It, Texas. She's also a part of a whole bunch of other organizations. She's a parent. She's one of us, people. She, just like us, started her kid in school and recognized that there were problems that needed to be solved. And just like us, the people in this room, she started with her teacher and realized that's not where the problem really is. So she went to the school and realized that's not really where the problem is. So she escalated and went up to a district level. That is partly where the problem is, but really, when you kind of look at the issues, you have to go all the way up to the state legislature and understand how they have impacted our schools through the decisions they've made in the last 30 or 40 years. We must change it. And Laura is a parent who said, I'm going to make this my project to change this in public education, just like many of us have done as well. And she has been successful. So welcome, Laura. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about yourself and your journey, and then talk about school funding for our parents.
And before you go, Laura, ¿does alguien necesita interpretación en español?
And if people come in later and let us know, Jody puede hacer la interpretación. Es mucho mejor que yo. So thank you, Daphne, and thank you all. ACPTA is really created a just fantastic group of advocates, which has grown over the years. When I started advocating, it wasn't doing this, and it's gotten better and better every year. So before I go and pull up my PowerPoint, I just want to give a little background about how I got involved with advocacy, because I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to sort of walk you guys through, and it has a lot of information. So I'm a parent of 3 kids who've gone through Austin Public Schools. My youngest one just graduated. She's a freshman in college. So my background was in policy, but it was international trade policy. It had nothing to do with education policy, but I got to Texas in 1998. My oldest son was 1. And then when he got to kindergarten was really my first foray into understanding there was something I needed to get engaged with. And it started on the testing front. I remember my kids had gone to Doss Elementary. The oldest was in kindergarten, and our PTA had raised enough money to pay for a Spanish teacher, which I speak several languages. I think it's vital. I grew up in Washington, D.C., where people were from all over, and our teachers voted it down because there was not enough time in the day, there was not enough time in the week for our students to have 20 minutes twice a week of Spanish and also prepare for the tax test. This wasn't STAR. So that was, I was like, what is this tax test? What's going on? And year by year, things would sort of grow. In 3rd grade, the same oldest son came home with a 50, he was getting 50s or 100s. He was a really good student. He loved to learn, and suddenly he didn't want to. And he came home, and I looked at his 50 on math, and I said, well, it's all right. What happened? And he said, well, Mom, it's not about whether it's right. I get half of the points if I do the tax prep method. I get 50 points if I circle it, star, and underline, but I don't understand their method. I understand it by looking at the big picture and understanding how the math works. So little by little it went, and when that kid was in 9th grade, suddenly there were going to be 15 end of course exams. It was going to be 15% of grades. And so it was just 9th grade parents. The older kids were doing tax. Only 9th graders were doing this, and a group of moms who were concerned got involved. And so that's where TAMSA started. And so I can talk a little bit more about TAMSA later. The next thing I did was I went and worked after my experience with TAMSA and at the legislature. I went and worked for the association called TAX. Ironically, it is not named after the test. It was the Texas Association of Community Schools, and it represents all the small school districts, which is 970 of the 1,100 school districts have fewer than 10 or 12,000 people in them. And through that, I covered all of the public education related hearings and reported back to the superintendents. And when I saw not just testing, I saw how it fit with funding and with accountability and with funding our teachers and all of the different issues. It helped me put some of it together. And I also saw these are mostly rural schools. And I saw rural poor saying, wow, well, Austin, they're super rich. And I was like, wait a minute, we are just having a competition of who's poorer, the urban or rural poor, and no one was getting enough. So following that session, I created Texas Educators Vote, because we realized how few people were voting, and said, what if we were to encourage educators to become educated and informed citizens and model that for students? Because I found out after that 2015 session, how few people voted and how few educators voted. And if you were to add up all the current and retired educators, it's 1.5 million people, which would make a huge difference in an election. So we created Texas Educators Vote. I'm going to talk about that later too. And then the last little group I started is funding related. And so I'm just going to tell you a teeny bit about that, and then I'll go to the PowerPoint and tell you how it all fits together and where we can advocate and you know what's going on. So in 2018, my youngest daughter was a junior at McCallum, and there were kids crying in the halls. And people were up in arms, and I didn't really know what was happening, but AISD had a $30 million budget deficit, and there were the budget stabilization task forces that some of you knew about, and there was a fear. You know, the district was looking for things to cut, and they were potentially going to cut the Fine Arts Academy, and people were extremely upset. And so I got put together with Janice Bookout, who is the head of Earth Day Austin, who had a kid at the Fine Arts Academy, and Allison Alter, who was my city council member. She's the District 10 city council member. And the three of us said, well, let us help educate parents who are mad, who are going to go to this task force meeting at McCallum, and only like 3 or 5 people could talk for a minute. Hundreds of people showed up, and we had a meeting and said, look, educators voted. They say this is the coming education session where we're going to talk about school funding. So let's talk to people and say, look, you can be mad at the district for a wide variety of reasons, and you should definitely engage. But school funding comes from the state level. And so we created Just Fund It, again in Austin ISD. And it grew again into a statewide advocacy organization and pushed to get more funding for our schools. So just all of this to give you a little background, all of this was, I just was a parent, but there were other parents. We did our research. We understood what was going on. We educated legislators and school board members and other parents, because not everybody has the time to do the research and then engage. So like anybody can do this. I'm not an educator. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen and talk through how I tie all this together. Okay, great. Can you all see my screen? Okay, and it's good because I can't see myself, which is probably the best. So I saw this quote, which is not just education specific, but it's really relevant to what's going on in education around the country, but especially here in Texas, which the way they privatize is you defund, make sure stuff doesn't work, make people mad, and then hand it over to private capital. So I'm going to sort of walk you all through how I think this is happening and how it relates to testing, funding, accountability, and the other issues. And then we're going to go sort of chunk by chunk, and you guys can ask questions at the end of each chunk, or we can ask questions at the end. I'm not going to take the whole time. Okay, let me go back to this. Okay, so underfunding, we're going to talk about that, and that is not giving the public schools enough money. So that's the first step of the defunding. The second step is going to be about really over-testing and punishing through STAR and other standardized testing. It's really distracting from some of the learning that needs to be happening. So that's how you sort of mess things up. The way you make people mad is through that accountability system, A through F. And then the privatization, you know, starting with charters, but they're pushing for vouchers again. So we're going to walk through these four different areas. So step one, systematically underfund. Again, this is happening across the country, but especially here in Texas. So when we started Just Fund It, we did our research, and together actually with, I think you're hearing from Raise Your Hand next week, they've been a partner on some of this. They've got some great research and some great graphics, but we looked, and according to Education Week's annual survey, we were 43rd in per student funding. So this is Texas, out of 50 states. We like to be number one. We were about $4,000 behind the national average. We're paying about 2/3 per student. And so I will add that if you actually just looked at how much Texas was paying per student, we'd be 49th. But because we're more equitable, because we do have Robin Hood system, we got like an F in straight out funding and a B in equity, and that bumped us up to 43rd. So that 43rd is accounting for us distributing from some of the property wealthy districts to the less property wealthy districts. So that was the situation in November 2018. We got together, started Just Fund It, and said, look, after what we'd seen, the legislature had been extremely effective in sort of pitting rich against poor, urban against rural, large against small. And while we were paying a ridiculous amount in, other districts were getting money, but basically what they do is they take the money, they shake it up, they suck some off, and we're going to talk about that and don't use it in education, and then nobody gets enough. So we said, look, we're not going to fight over the scraps. We're going to argue that every kid deserves better, and that every one of the 5.5 million kids in Texas public schools deserves to be better than 43rd in per student funding. And I will also put that in perspective. Like our state pays, I think it's the second highest expenditure is public ed. Public ed and public health cost a lot. I mean, if we did decide to take the Medicaid money, I'm not going to go there. We're talking about education today. But we spend on other stuff. We're spending 3 times as much to incarcerate each person than we are to educate them, and that this is appalling. And these figures I pulled together a year or 2 ago, but it's still the same ratio. And they're, the better you educate people and the less we push them from the school to prison pipeline, the fewer people we put in prison, but we are spending money on some things, and this should make people mad, if nothing else. So this was a slide from going in. And so one thing that Austin does get, it's the largest payer of recapture. And the way it works is as our property taxes rise in local property taxes, the state would pay less. So in 2008, it was almost half and half. And then by 2019, it was, 62% was coming from our local tax dollars, and the state wasn't really paying their share. So we said, we need you to pay more of your share. We're going to look at House Bill 3. They did start paying more of their share, but it didn't grow the pie all that much. So you can't just say we want you to pay your share. We do send the most back to our state, and we do pay. It did reduce our recapture a little bit with House Bill 3, but we still rely a lot on property tax. And so in 2011, when we had when we had a recession, they balanced the budget on the back of Texas kids, and we need to make sure they're not going to do that again this session. So that is going to be a big talking point. I'm going to talk for a minute about recapture and how it works, because it's confusing and we do pay a lot. And the reason we pay a lot is the way the formula goes. And this is how we tie together some of the issues we're going to talk about. So the formula is pretty straightforward. It's the number of students enrolled divided by the property value of your taxable area. So as each child leaves to either go to a pod and not enroll in school, gets gentrified out of the city, chooses to go to a charter, that number in the numerator goes down. On the bottom is our property tax value. And our property tax rate is lower than a lot of districts. A lot of districts are taxing at the highest rate, but they don't have a lot of taxable value. They don't have appreciating property. So they're taxed out all the way, but they can't raise any more money. Meanwhile, our property values are through the roof. So our denominator's going up, right? So if your numerator's smaller and your denominator's bigger, your number of wealth per child looks higher. So you pay more back to the state. So that is why our recapture keeps going up. And so it's important each kid that goes to a charter. It's important each kid that does not enroll this year. And it, what else was I going to say on this one? So our money is going in. It is going straight in, and they're not looking at, when they say wealth, they're not talking about wealth of the students. You know, we have more and more economically disadvantaged students. We have more and more emerging bilingual students, special ed students. They haven't changed those formulas, I believe, since the 80s. I think Edna's on, she can talk to that later too, but they haven't changed that, but it's costing more and more to educate our children while we are sending more back. And again, it's not all going into public ed. This slide talks to that. The fact that money raised for public education should be spent on education. And I think taxpayers naturally think that money that says public education would go to public ed. But there's no law that says money raised for public education stays in education. And so this biennium, $3.7 billion raised for education went to fund other things. Could have been anything. And so Donna Howard, who again is a fantastic local rep, she every session has proposed a bill saying money raised for education should stay in education. I think she and or Kirk Watson had a bill saying 50% of funding should come from the state. Neither of those have been heard, neither have been passed. I mean, if the House changes hands, maybe we would hear these and they would pass. We're going to get to voting a little bit later. But these are important things that people don't know. Okay, hold on. The other thing, here, let me go back one. Oh, I can't go back, so let's hope I don't need to go back. When we had got just funded and they were starting to hear House Bill 3, so people voted, the legislature heard that it was time to talk about funding, and they had different proposals out there in the last legislative session. The House had proposed like $5 or $6 billion, and the Senate maybe 3, and then the House Democratic Caucus said, well, maybe 14. And we went around as just funded and said, look, we really appreciate you talking about funding our schools. We really do. We know nobody's done it for a long, long time, but we need you to understand that this has to be a long-term process, because if we wanted to be average, you know, keep in mind we're 43rd. If we wanted to get to average, it would take $44 billion this biennium. And people just said, I beg your pardon? We said, no, we really appreciate it. We know you're doing a lot. We know $5 billion's a lot, $6 billion's a lot, but we're super far behind. So it was a reality check. And I think we said what we're asking you for is either an inflationary factor or for you to commit to making this a long-term plan. I mean, COVID came and we're going to see that. So it's going to be hard to make a lot of headway this session, but just keeping in mind, we're 43rd, we're still 43rd. So this is what happened with House Bill 3. We did get closer to 42nd. When every legislator pats themselves on the back and says we had transformative change, we did get a lot more money than we ever have before, but it literally got us closer to 42nd. Like, we're way behind. So a total of $14.2 billion was put in there. $5 billion went to property tax relief. A lot of the numbers along the bottom are super important. Special ed, still not enough. Money for teachers, still not enough. School safety, but the $6.5 billion was for school funding. And that's what raised the basic allotment. I think the next slide says on average about $600 per kid. I mean, we're still 4,000 behind. And as we moved up, all the other states moved up too. So it's definitely progress, and we super appreciate it. And it was the first real increase in a long, long time. But it gets us about back to where we were when we lost that $5 billion, the last time. So we're not done. This session will be about cutting. And so this session, we're going to have to fight to keep what we have and say, we've done a lot, don't mess with public ed. So this is the sort of post-mortem. Where are we after? Well, there is more for kids. We're still 43rd, but it still would have to invest a lot more money to bring us to the national average. So then enters COVID, right? So we're already underfunded. The president the governor, everyone sort of playing politics with this. Go back to school, COVID's a thing, it's not a thing, we'll fund you, we won't fund you, we're gonna fund you if you show up, we're not gonna fund you, we're gonna fund you if the health professionals say it's okay. I mean, whiplash. Our superintendents and our school boards have worked nonstop trying to follow the changes. And these are political changes. These were not necessarily changes grounded in what is best for children and what is best for teachers. Meanwhile, there's anxiety among families, which is exacerbating these inequities. Those with means have been able to set up a pod. Those who do not have the means are in a different situation, are often those families of color and low-income families that are most at risk of getting COVID, of dying from COVID, who are frontline workers who need their kids to go to school. I mean, it's really exacerbated the inequities on top of the access to technology, to the internet. So there are all sorts of issues. And then there are groups that are looking to take advantage. I mean, there's this disaster capitalism where they're gonna be pushing for online vouchers. They're gonna be pushing their groups online. There are Facebook groups. There are new groups that are pushing to get school board members elected who really want to fund alternative methods and not our public schools. So it's a bit of a mess. Things we can do right now while we're still in this first issue of funding is Just Funded had a petition that a lot of you probably signed. We had about 3,000 signatures. I sent it to the governor and to the heads of both the appropriations and the public education committees. Crickets, nothing from anyone, but basically saying right now they are saying they will fund our schools for the first 4 weeks at the full hold harmless level from last year. But after that, you need a special approval from the commissioner alone, who has a ton of power, who is appointed by the governor, to decide whether they're going to fund the schools. And I just an hour ago listened to the Texas Tribune Festival discussion where they spoke with the chairs of House Public Ed, Chairman Huberty and Larry Taylor from the Senate. And they said, well, if you're not going to go back to school, you're saving money. We're not going to give you all the money. And if your kids aren't enrolled after the first 4 weeks, don't think we're going to send you all that money. You're not paying for electricity. So for one, it costs more to educate in person, online, hybrid, do it all. But there's a serious risk if we do not enroll our kids while we're doing whatever else, that there will not be funding when it comes next time. It's important to vote, and we're going to talk about how leaders at every level affect education. And then I'd love it, I mean, if you all can join Just Funded, there's a, well, we can post the link later and send it out, but we need more advocates. I mean, they need an army of people, and you need to call your friends and family across the state, because, you know, the People's Republic of Austin, they don't all listen to us. The Texas Capitol looks very different than Austin, and legislators need to hear from people in their own hometowns as well. And so one other thing I will mention when it talks about funding before I move on to the next step, and we'll talk to some other issues later when we get to charters about how that's affecting funding, but I did listen to an interview also with the Texas Tribune, and you should all follow the Texas Tribune. It's fantastic reporting on public policy, but they interviewed the comptroller a couple months back and said, what's the deficit looking like? And they said, well, we thought we had this $11 billion deficit. We really only have about a $7 billion deficit because we found $4 billion. $1.2 billion from the CARES money for public ed, $1.7 billion from increased property tax, $700 million from increased recapture, and then the other $700 million was from some other thing. But pretty much $3.5 to $4 billion of that came from public ed, which they're hanging on to. So we need to tell them they already have our money, that they can't take anymore. So that's step one. Do you guys want me to stop for a minute before we move on to the next part? Are there any questions on this first section? No? Okay. So the next step in the privatization formula is to make sure things don't work. And since 1980, we've pretty much been doing that with standardized testing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So standardized testing started in Texas, and then we moved it to the federal government with No Child Left Behind. Now there's a new law, it's called Every Student Succeeds Act. And honestly, the initial intention seemed good, to make sure that kids were not falling through the cracks, to break out, to give a baseline test and see how kids were doing, to make sure that under the students with, whether students with special needs, low-income students, Black, Latino, you know, there's certain populations that were sort of falling through the cracks. And so the point of No Child Left Behind originally was to see how everyone was doing, to break it out, not to hide them among the some, and then to shine a light, and presumably I would imagine would be to give additional resources. It has morphed into, instead of giving additional resources, it is punishing those who need the most, who do the worst, on these tests, which are biased as well. And that's a whole different equity discussion. So, I mean, we've ended up, through our accountability system, which is the next step, really teachers are being limited. They're being forced to focus on standardized testing, since that is the only thing we're grading the districts and the schools based on. Students are being given mind-numbing test prep in lieu of engaging project-based learning. And I will say, not all schools. You know, not all schools do this to the same extent, not all districts do this to the same extent, but I will say, I saw it at a high-performing public, you know, elementary school, and when my kid went to the magnet, they didn't do it. He went to Keeling because they knew every kid was gonna pass in the magnet. They did not do test prep. They didn't care if they got the highest score, and that's wrong. Every kid in every school should be able to have meaningful and engaging learning. And what we see more often than not is in our predominantly, we have extremely segregated schools, often in the East Side schools, the ones that get the lowest scores, that have the most needs, those kids lose recess. They lose their electives because they've got to pass the test, or they're going to close the school or hand it over to a charter. So it's being used to punish, and these kids that need the most are getting the least. Okay, sorry, don't mean to go into a little rant about that, but this really makes me mad. And it's narrowing learning. We are spending a lot of money. I'll show you a slide on that. And it's playing into the privatizers' hands. So that's what I'm going to say on that. I'm going to show you how it's ramped up over the last, good gracious, 40 years. So it started, I mean, each time it's been tabs, teams, tasks, tax, star. It started with a you know, basic competency test, and they've added more stakes as you go along. By 2015 or 2013, that was when they were going to have the 15 end of course exams. You know, one was going to be physics. I would still be in high school. I have a master's degree in international economics. I would not have finished high school if I had to pass a standardized test in physics. So they added tests. We have tests that are far beyond what's required by federal law. There is no federal law that requires high stakes at any level. And so we've really ratcheted it up, and that's been a push. That's been a push directly from people who, I mean, and I will say TAMHSA is not against accountability. We want diagnostic tests that give meaningful information to educators, to parents, and to students. The point of it is to see where we have needs and to increase it, and the tests we're using are not that. Let me look and see if I'm saying anything that I said I was going to say. In terms of high stakes on students, when we started TAMHSA, there were about 27 states that required you to pass a standardized test to graduate. There are now 11, and we are still one of them. Just to show you some of the stuff that there's left to advocate for. So we have more tests that are required by federal law, and that's a state decision. The required tests are English and math every year from 3rd to 8th grade for reporting purposes, and one science in middle school, and then an English, math, and a science in high school. That's it. The social studies are extra. There are 5 end of course exams. We only need to have 3. And then the way we wrote the title of our TEKS and wrote it as ELAR, now the TEA is saying instead, you know, well, we've been saying we don't need these writing tests, which are set up to teach our kids bad writing, you know, formulaic 26-line essays. They have said, because the way they entitled it, they need to include writing questions in every single grade. So they are reformulating some of those questions. So there's more, and there's a new bill that was passed last session that had no public hearing that was pushed through. So in any event, it drives the accountability system. It continues, you know, last session they wanted to fund the schools based on how kids did on the standardized tests, and we killed that at the lowest level, at the 3rd grade level, but they did incorporate that into some of the measures in the accountability system in the high schools. And I will say that's one of the arguments for sending kids back immediately. Commissioner Morath said right up, we are going to test every kid. and we need to get them to school so we can test them, because he loves to say, teaching without testing is just talking. So,
Laura, could I ask a question for our audience here around this?
Sure
I think
thing.
because we have varying levels of expertise, could you please please let us know, like, who determines which standardized test in the state of Texas is given?
So the Texas legislature, and I'm going to go into this on the voting section, the Texas legislature determines how many tests, whether they have high stakes on them. The Texas Education Agency has a contract with testing companies, and have I shown you guys the money number yet? I wish I could get in here. Hold on a sec and go back one. No, I'm going to show you the money in a minute. But TEA works on the tests and on developing them with Pearson, with ETS, with whoever does it. But the legislature, so your elected officials, your legislature, your rep, your senator, and the lieutenant governor and governor. Lieutenant governor decides what comes up to be voted on. When we had Tamsin, we pushed for House Bill 5 to reduce the number of tests. The lieutenant governor at that time held it hostage until his charter bill passed in the House to hear the testing bill. Like, this is not free of political engagement. So thank you, Lisa. So I just wanted to show how the high stakes standardized testing, I mean, it hurts everyone. It was a pain for my kids. They were gonna be fine. Private schools advertise all the time. You don't have to take a standardized test. You can do real learning. Charters double down on the testing. Sometimes that helps the kids, and sometimes that's not giving them what they want. I know a lot of people who've gone and come back because they're missing out on a lot of the other learning as well. But this, I can't walk you through it because my picture is in front of it here. But basically what I'd mentioned, how we are taking away meaningful learning and forcing kids to do well just on the test, they're being forced out of the system, and it is fueling that school to prison pipeline. In addition to the fact that the way these tests are written are not sensitive to racial, income level biases. So there are a lot of issues, and the kids that do the worst are not only low income students of color, dyslexic students by far are the ones that fail these tests at the highest level, and English language learners. So it's a big deal, and any of you engaged on those issues, we need your advocacy on those topics as well.
Laura, can I quickly step in a moment here?
Yeah.
What's really important about this is that it's a system that has been proven that the people who do poorly or well on the first taking of it consistently do poorly or well, regardless of the teachers, regardless of the school, regardless of the curriculum. You're either built for these tests or you're not built for these tests. And when I say built, I mean, you've got the vocabulary, you've got the experiences, you've got the, the mind that works in a certain way. And what happens every time is people who just naturally do well on this test, they don't even try. At some point, they don't even try, right? They just have to beat a certain number. And so you lose interest at the high end. The high achievers don't really need to push themselves. They just have to do well on this test. On the low end, it's devastating, because if you fail this test, you're, like Laura talked about, you are subject to a whole bunch of, anti-education education, really. You're prepped, you're put in this test prep kind of program. And what we see is that people who don't do well, they just give up. Why would you want to participate in a system that is built against you, that no matter what you do, how much time you take out of your day to try to succeed at it, you can't do it? And it is because of experiences. It is because of vocabulary and home, experiences, I guess is the right word. So this is dire. This is dire. It's not just affecting the kids who don't do well. It is devastating to our entire education system that we continue to allow this in our schools. Okay, I'm sorry. I just had to interject to make sure.
That's super important, and that raises another point, which people don't understand. There's a guy named John Tanner who talks about this, and then Walter Stroop, who some of you may know, can talk about it as well. But we say these tests are meant to measure. They say they're like curriculum-based tests. So I just remember, you go to a class, right? You study the chapter that if your teacher's giving you a test, and presumably, like, if it's something I'm bad at, I'm going to get the easy stuff right, but then I'm going to get the bad stuff wrong. So maybe I'll get like a 70. But what they do on these tests, there are psychometricians. It's like a whole industry, and they're at every district, and there are hundreds of them at DEA set up to make tests that can sort children. These tests are not really measuring if you know the information. So what they do is they have field questions, right, to figure out what's going to be on next year's test. So they ask the questions. If there's a question that 80% of the kids get right, which to me means they learned something, they don't use those. If there's a question that 80% of the kids get wrong, they don't use those. They want the questions that can get like 50-50. They can sort the kids because they are sorting them over a bell curve, because they are trying to have winners and losers, because they say, while the federal government, and this is where the federal government comes in, they say for the accountability system, you need to tell us the lowest 5% performing. Our state, you know, in some states you can say this is the lowest 5% performing, but they still got a C. Our state says the lowest 5% performing is going to get an F or a D. And so even though the law says everybody should be able to get an A, we are not, we set it up so it is more of a sorting mechanism than to see what your kids know. So when you get that score, it doesn't really tell you what they know. It doesn't tell teachers what they know. And just to get back to this slide, I mean, this is an old slide that we put together for TAMSA. I mean, in the first 15 years of this century, we spent $1.5 billion on testing, but that didn't include the testing coordinators at every school. This doesn't include the unfunded mandates at every school. The testing coordinators, the security, the counselors you've pulled off to monitor the tests, the remediation for each child. Each time they retest, it's a ton of money. And there was a bill that was put out last session to see how much we're really spending at each level, and that was not heard or passed. It's absurd. And I will say, I was talking to the head of the Texas Counseling Association the other day, and she raised another issue. She said that this is when the standardized tests are given is when the suicide rate goes up, when self-harm goes up, when those students need their counselors, and those counselors are not available because they are monitoring tests. Big deal, lots of stuff. But on the money, it's
sorry, Laura, I'm going to interject there. Also, we found out that during testing time, our mental health centers for students are so full that when children have true, and it's not saying that the mental health associated with the STAR is not true, but when they have psychotic episodes or breakdowns unrelated to the STAR, they can't get help. Because of the STAR, our mental health facilities that service young people fill up. That is completely unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
It's a nightmare. And so this is making our public schools not work. It's making us focus wholeheartedly on this. And it's something that needs to change at every level of government. I will just say for this, when we would go talk to people years ago, we would say it's $2 every second of every day going to testing. $2, $2, $2. I mean, that's crazy. Okay, let me get to that next slide. So stuff you can do, school board, legislature, vote, join TAMSA. I will say our school district has not been a leader at pushing back against testing. There are school districts that say, we are not going to talk about the STAR. We are not going to hang up a banner saying that we are doing great. We are going to give our kids engaging, meaningful, project-based learning, and they will be fine. But we are taking away meaningful learning when a student doesn't do well on STAR. We are hindering our dual language efforts when kids are most of the way in both languages, when they don't do great on a third grade STAR, and we have room to move. We're going to get new board members. We have a new superintendent. There is room for us to advocate on this, and our superintendent scorecard is extremely dependent on high stakes standardized testing. So a lot of these groups I joined, we created in spite of the district because it was easier to make headway at the state level than the district level. So I wouldn't discount efforts to engage locally as well. And then, you know, Albert Einstein did badly on standardized tests. They wrote him off, and, you know, we are not all the same. We are not widgets. And I will say one thing, when we'll get to charters, I've met with several of the charters, and I think, you know, a lot of them do have good intentions, but when I've asked what they're doing, they're doubling down on testing. And when I've said, they said, you know, they've incorporated some methodologies that we don't like in our public schools of memorizing words, memorizing certain things to get kids to pass the STAR. And I'm like, is your goal for them to pass the STAR, or is your goal for them to learn and to be a lifelong learner? Because I don't think that they are necessarily the same thing. So anyway, okay. I can go to the next step. Does anybody want to stop and talk about testing in the at this stage, or do we want to go on to the next step of privatization?
Laura, I want to make one more point. Dr. Holly is the equity officer, and when I talked to her about standardized testing, like her first week in our district, she gave me this beautiful analogy that said, what we're looking for is a healthy ecosystem. What standardized testing does is try to make every single thing in your garden a tree. And in this case, I would call the tree, a tree with white ash bark and a burnt orange canopy, right? That is what the standardized testing is trying to force all of our children into, this stand of trees. And in a healthy ecosystem, you have healthy tulips as well, and healthy grass, right? You have ducks and birds, everybody's healthy. Right now, our system is set up so that only this giant stand of trees sucking up they're the beneficiaries of, years of housing policies that worked in their favor, of education policy that worked in their favor, of employment policy, all of these things, the United States that have supported these trees, right? These trees are sucking all the resources out of everything around it. The grass underneath these giant stand of trees is dead. The plants in the yard, everything's being shaded out by this giant stand of trees. And we give birth to our children and say, I want my kid to be a tree. But the fact is, and then we push them and the schools push them, everybody's got to be a tree. But the fact is our trees are bending and breaking. The mental health issues affecting our stand of trees is very profound, and it's self-made, right? But the rest of our ecosystem, we want our tulips to be tulipy. We don't want them to take a test to see how much of a tree they are. We want our ducks to be ducks, and we want our birds to be birds, and making everybody take a test to see how tree-y they are is not healthy. It's not healthy. It's an abusive relationship. It is abuse to try to make your little tulip into a tree. That is not our job as parents. It is not the job of educators. It is not the job of the state. And I think as a parent, we have a responsibility to stand up and create an umbrella of protection against this worldview for our children so that they can grow up and be tulips and live in an environment where tulips are valued, where ducks are valued, where things are valued beyond this giant stand of trees. And so that is the vision, and that is why all of this has to go. It's not okay to keep doing this to our kids. And so get mad. I see it in the chat. Get angry. This is appalling that they're taking advantage of our children this way and taking advantage of our goodwill and our willingness to just say, yeah, we're trusting you to educate our kids, and this is not education. It's not okay anymore. So this was a beautiful vision that I think about all the time that came from our diversity group, because diversity is not about all of us being a tree and all of us going to the same university. It really is about honoring what's special about each and every one of our kids.
No, thank you, Daphne, and thank you to Dr. Holly, because that is a perfect vision. I will say, I'm not against some diagnostic testing. Our teachers do it all the time. And part of this is a lack of trust of teachers. This is saying we don't trust you to do the right thing. And so I do think, if they need to give something statewide or district-wide to see how the kids are doing, I want everyone to be able to read. I want everyone to be able to do the basic math they need to live, but we have gone overboard. And we have done it at the district level. I'm hearing from teachers that we're putting in short cycle assessments and extra benchmarks and all sorts of things. So we need some people I've been waiting for a meeting with the new superintendent with TAMSA, and I've asked several times and I have not yet gotten it. So join me in that conversation when it's time. But again, I'm not against testing. We need some basic skills but we need kids to be who they are and celebrate the diversity of our children and let them grow to be the diverse leaders that we need them to be. So, okay, I'm gonna go on to the accountability system, which is forcing a lot of this. We have an A through F accountability system, which I will say it's a law. This A through F was adopted a couple sessions ago. ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, is the extremely conservative organization that writes stand your ground laws, A through F laws, voucher laws. It's mostly very conservative states that have adopted these systems. Virginia adopted it, and then they realized what was happening and they got rid of it. But it is intended to shame and blame and then close schools and hand them over. So I'm not going to do a ton on this, but I'm on the Accountability Policy Advisory Committee. I'm the only parent on it. We advise the commissioner. He doesn't have to listen. It's mostly superintendents and, you know, some charter leaders and the chamber and some legislators. But basically, we've created this A through F system, which is the only thing that we rate our schools on. It is only based on STAR and K through 8. It's mostly STAR in 9 through 12. They add in graduation, but there was a push from less supportive public education people, more privatizing, to count graduation less. There is a career, college, and military readiness portion of it. But again, a lot of that's based on how they do on AP and how they do on, you know, how much growth there is on STAR. Again, the tests aren't diagnostic. They're meant to sort, not measure. I will give you one example of that. In elementary schools, in the beginning, they were trying to diversify it. So they said, well, let's include attendance. So it wasn't just going to be STAR, it was going to be attendance. So the kids in elementary school go to school a lot of the time. And so the responses or the numbers that came back was 96% to 100%. Of, you know, kids in different schools were attending. So the 96% attendance became an F, right? So since it was 96 to 100, they stretched it. 96 was an F, 100 was an A. That's why all these elementary schools got C's, because the kids were there 98% of the time. So it just shows you how our system is not measuring what it says it's measuring. It is meant to sort. And it's forcing failures. It doesn't need to, but it is forcing failures. And the way the federal accountability system is set up, it says that you can align, the new one, which was looser than No Child Left Behind, said you can align your state with the federal government, freeing up for other non-test-based things. And we chose just to make the federal one match ours. We didn't make it any less test focused. So the accountability system is what drives it. If that's all that you were grading districts on and campuses on, then that's what is going to be expected of teachers and students. It rolls down the hill. It is, I mean, for TAMSA, we're pushing to get rid of the high stakes on students, to have no more than are required, but really we need to change the accountability system. And the way you do that is by getting people who think that it is not a great accountability system. And our current leaders are deeply in love with it at the state level. This is super confusing. Someone way smarter than I am did this Skittle chart, but it basically shows you how the D's and F's and A's and B's pan out. And generally the high concentration of low income students are where the low test scores are. I mean, anyone will tell you there's a direct relationship, whether it's the SAT or whether it's STAR, between income level. So you're not necessarily measuring what the kids know. Again, you're punishing schools for having needs that are being unmet. So before I go to charters, does anybody have any questions or comments on just accountability specifically? It's not like a sexy issue, but it is important. And I will say, realtors need to understand and push back against it. It was the realtors that killed it in Virginia. The realtors pushed for it here. And I will say, when I sold my house in Northwest Hills and I went back and I loved my realtor, I looked at the notebook she put together and she printed out the STAR scores. I almost had a nervous breakdown. I do not think that that's what should sell a house, personally. So I'm going to go on to the next part and just talk about the privatization section, which is really, you underfund, you make it not work, you make people mad. I'm hearing from people in very high performing schools that they're very upset that they got a C and they're going to leave their school. The school's not doing anything different. It just got a different label. It's crazy, and people don't know that. So here's some information. It came from TEA, but looking at, so here we're 43rd in funding our public schools, but at the same time, we have been funding a completely second system of public schools called charters. Now, charters are public in that they get public money. They're not publicly run. They're not held to the same standards. And we'll go into some of that. Most of them are charter operators, which are private, and we'll see a little bit about that. But if you look at the growth, it is really growing fast. And just in the last 8 years, almost $23 billion of taxpayer funding has not gone to the public schools. It's been instead put off onto charters. And for this next year, the statistic shows that 7% of students are getting 15% of the funding. Now, charters get all of their funding from the state. They get all of it. The districts get some from the state and then some from their local tax base. But since there isn't a tax base for charters, they're getting all of it. Charters were created just like No Child Left Behind. I think charters were created with not necessarily ill intent, who knows? But the goal was to create incubators for creative ideas to be funneled back into our public schools, ideas for innovation. But what instead has happened, that hasn't happened, and instead it has been created as a form of competition. For one, as I mentioned before, every kid who leaves to go to a charter not only is money that's not going to the public schools, but it increases AISD's recapture because our numerator is getting smaller. They also they're not playing by the same rules. They're not serving all kids. They have and I'll show you a statistic, way lower percentage of special ed students. And Lisa can, talk to I believe you had some experience looking to see, and they're not providing special ed services. They can boot kids out if they don't do well on tests. They can boot kids out if they have behavior issues. They come back to the public schools. Enrollment, this is just a picture of enrollment growth, and then they just approved more charters this last week at State Board of Education. The people who do that, so if you want to know who's in charge of that, so to get a new charter, the commissioner says something, but really the State Board of Education votes, and we've got several State Board of Education positions that are open. Once they're there, whether it's an idea or a KIP or a Great Heart or whatever, once a charter has a foothold in the state, it can expand and open hundreds of campuses only with the approval of the commissioner, who is a huge charter advocate. And so it's not, and that's not an elected official, that's an appointed official. So it is growing. And while we are underfunded, we are growing the second level of schooling. And so if you look, this I thought was a really helpful picture that shows, traditional public schools relative to charters, our ISDs are doing better academically. They have more experienced teachers. They have a better student-teacher ratio. They're allocating more of their money for instruction. They're spending more money for support services, career and tech, health services. They're serving more at-risk students, more students with disabilities. And then on the other side, what the charters are higher at is administrative costs. Are paying more to the people, just like the guy who was in charge of IDEA who got his private plane. They are spending a lot of money on marketing. I get a lot of postcards to send my kids to charters, and they get a lot of privately funded advocacy organizations are working with them. So it's a big deal. Just AISD specifically lost more than $100 million just last year to charters. And then what happens is the way they're funded is every charter, the kids in charters get funded at the state average, not at the district they're in average. And they're mostly in urban districts which are not getting the highest average. So in AISD, every kid in a charter in our area is getting about $1,200 more per kid, which ends up being about $26,000 more per classroom. And then again, I'm just going to keep honing in on the recapture. And then, and this is from Patty Everett, who's the charter expert extraordinaire, saying that if IDEA's expansion is approved, which it will be, that's about $1 billion with very little oversight. I broke out what some goals would be for each of these areas for going into the session, or just right now. And I'll run through that before we get to the next section, and then we can stop for some questions. In terms of funding, we've asked for a hold harmless for the whole year. Fund us based on last year's levels. We're in a pandemic. It costs a lot of money to do all the stuff we're doing. Don't yank us around. We've hired teachers. Please don't change it 4 weeks in. Again, we haven't gotten any feedback, but we're going to keep pushing on that. Increase funding, which really also is, please don't take away any more funding. Please stop funding 2 systems. We are desperately in need of funding 1 system, so halt increasing charters. And then stop wasting money on testing. We spend so much money. And then on the testing level, we did get a STAR waiver last year, but we have not asked for one for this year. Indiana has, Georgia has, several Republican-led states have asked. We may not get it. Betsy DeVos is saying, no, you're not going to get it, but we could ask, and our state has not asked. We'd love to get rid of high stakes on students. We should be using diagnostic tests that are informing our teachers, and we should have no more than federally required tests. And then on accountability, they should be waiving A through F this year. There's no way it's going to be telling us anything of any value. We should get rid of that system. We should revamp and diversify so it's not just test-based, and use the results to help instead of punish. So I'm going to go into voting next, but before I get there, I just want to say, like, from these groups, we need you. We need you in doing ACPTA advocacy, but honestly, to help inform that advocacy, we need more people. I mean, the people who started TAMSA, our kids have all graduated from college. Like, they're old. We started this a long time ago, and these same people are on the board. We've got parents that are engaged but don't realize that there's still so much more to fight for. So for all of these, if you can go to the website and like sign up for the list and follow us on social media, just fund it. We really need you to hold the line. We need help this session. And then I'm going to talk about voting next. But before I get on to voting, because it does tie in, does anybody have any questions you guys want me to talk about? Lisa?
We do have a few questions in the chat. One question is, there's a person that doesn't understand how IDEA, and I don't mean the law, I mean the charter school, is getting more money when public state records say that they don't. And I think that this person's referencing some documents from texasschools.gov. So that the question is just like, how do we know they're getting more money when the public state records say they are not?
So it's an interesting argument that goes back and forth at the Capitol. The charters say that they get less. The public schools say the charters get more. There are statistics, and I can't hand it to you today on this call, but we can get you the information. The bottom line is they are getting they're getting the state average. They're getting the state average, not the district average. And the state average is more than the district average. Each district has a little bit different amount. And so like they're getting the small school bump. So IDEA gets the same amount of extra money that small schools get for being, what's it called?
I know what you're talking about. The small school state scale.
Small school adjustment, because they don't have economies of scale. But if you add up all the IDEA kids, it is not a small district. So they're getting extra in that regard. And so just vis-a-vis AISD, I put out that number of how much more they're getting per kid. I can get you that information.
So a second question that we got is, how do charter schools affect funding at a local and state level?
Well,
I guess the question is like, how does that impact, if I'm translating the question correctly, how does it affect traditional ISDs?
So the state says we don't have enough money to pay the ISDs, but they are spending all of this extra money to fund two systems. So the arguments at the Capitol are, you know what, if you were funding the traditional public schools average for the country, then go ahead if you want to fund a second system. But by half-assedly funding two, it's not really helping the kids. It affects it because it's coming from the same pot of money. It's coming from the same pot of money. And right now, like, there were several charters that that have gotten approved that are competing with super high functioning schools. They're fighting for the same kids. We're paying for double education. It's like putting two gas stations next to each other. I mean, the bottom line is it's treating it as a competitive model and not as a public good. I personally think public education, and it is in our Texas Constitution, is required, is a public good. It is part of our community. It is part of democracy and part of society. And we're halfway funding both. So the numbers I gave, every charter that leaves, the kid gets that amount of money, and that money gets taken away from the public school.
Okay, and a third one for this section, or actually there's two very brief ones. One is, are charter schools for profit?
So there are public charters and there are public charters and for-profit charters. In Texas, for-profit charters are not legal. However, there are private companies that are profiting that manage these public charter schools. So we have public charter schools, but people are making a lot of money off of them. They are, it is a lottery system, but they are not forced to take every kid. They're not forced to offer busing. They're not forced to offer lunches. They are not forced to offer transportation. They're not, it's different. They're held to different standards. They do have to give the kids tests, and they are rated in that regard. Some of them have alternative ratings based on the kids that they're serving. Does that answer that question?
I believe so. And then the last one is, do charter schools require that teachers be certified?
No. No.
Okay.
Public schools do.
And
Charters don't.
And there's one question, basically just sort of, I think there's some questions around how the A through F accountability and like 1882 tie together as a 1-2 punch. Could you briefly touch on that?
I can try. So the deal is 1882 said that if you turn one of your campuses over, so you have a campus that's not doing great on the accountability system, and if you have one campus doing badly, you can't get the highest rating for your district. So districts don't want campuses to do bad. I mean, they don't want campuses to do badly anyway, but there's an incentive that you can use the 1882 law to get extra funding. If you make it a charter instead of a traditional public school, you'll get more per kid. So districts are like, sweet, we need dollars. So they'll bring in a charter instead of working with that traditional public school to do it. So it's just a form of increasing charters and to get more money. It's an incentive to get more money by making them charters, bottom line.
Thank you, Laura. I think that was all the questions for this section. Thank you.
Okay. So the hopeful part is one, I mean, honestly, parents engaging makes a big difference. We've made a difference at every level, but really voting is where it's at. That's where your power is. So for the next 6 weeks, we need to really get people focused on voting. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Texas Educators Vote and why we created it. This is a snapshot from last week. So there are fewer days, maybe they're 49 days until the election. But basically, Texas Educators Vote now has 28 organizations. It's principal groups, teacher groups, the League of Women Voters, high school coaches, pretty much anyone that reaches out to any mentor for any student that's involved with public ed. We may get the Counseling Association to join. To encourage people to be educated and engaged voters and to model civic engagement for students. So when the kids in school now grow up, they know that voting is part of being a grown-up. It's part of being a citizen, and it's part of being part of our society. And so I, run the website, and we are very active on social media with information. And it's about, the TEKS every year from kindergarten through 12th grade, there are social studies TEKS that require learning about voting, civic engagement. There is a first grade TEK that you can see that says something about holding public officials accountable and voting. So it's about modeling what we're teaching. And so there's key information on there. Because educators turned out and voted, we started this in 2015, educators got involved, and not just Texas Educators Vote, but a lot of other things. People got, educators around the country were striking over teacher pay. It was a big deal. Our teachers can't strike. That's against the law in Texas. They're not allowed to officially, they're not allowed to strike. They'll all get fired. So they didn't do that, but they voted. And so I think in great part, people will attribute our education session to educators voting. You can see voter turnout went up a ton, but if you look at this pie chart, it's crazy. Not only is there the 12.6% of people that were eligible and didn't register, but 41.4% of people were registered and didn't vote. So that's what gets me out of bed each day. Why didn't they vote? Did they not associate their vote with what their daily life is. I mean, we need people to understand, whether it's educators, whether it's people who care about public ed, how it relates to their everyday life. And so one message we're truly trying to share is that education is on the ballot at every level. And I will give one example. I used to walk with a friend of mine who is of a different political persuasion than I am. And she was very upset because she wanted her daughter to go to UT, and then they passed the campus carry. And she said, well, I can't send her to UT. They're going to have guns on campus. And I said, well, okay, well, did you pay attention to how people voted? She said, what? And I said, well, every legislator in one party but one voted to have the guns on campus. And every legislator but one voted not to have the guns on campus. So if that's your issue, pay attention. It's out there. The same with teachers are getting to school and seeing, like, I know at McCallum, like a raccoon fell on the principal's head. The school, you know, they're doing too much testing. There's not enough funding. The buildings are falling apart. But they're not paying attention to that when they vote. So we have recently broken down, and we'll be doing more social media on it, how schools are funded. You know, 8% of our funds come from the federal government, and that is IDEA funding, that is school lunches, Title I funding. The president has a role. He appoints the Secretary of Education. He picked Betsy DeVos. Well, you like Betsy DeVos? Great. You don't like Betsy DeVos? Great. The president picks that person. Congress allocates funds and sets federal testing framework and accountability requirements through which we must comply. The state is responsible for most of it. This is a state thing, public ed, for the most part. It's a huge deal. 92% of our funding comes from the state, and it determines how much overall there's going to be. It determines how much comes from the state versus local, but it determines the big picture as well. The governor, as I mentioned, appoints Mike Morat. He's made a ton of decisions that are affecting our everyday life, going back to school, testing, curriculum, charter approvals, all of that. And then the legislature determines the funding, passes, you know, how many tests you have to pass, all those different things, what tests you have to take. The state board writes curriculum and approves or denies charter applications. And then the trustees, we have 4 new ones up, and there are a lot of people running. So we should all be paying attention. They hire and set goals for the superintendent. They pass district policies. They determine how funding is allocated within the district. They are in charge of bonds and tax rates, and they make, you know, final decisions on teachers. So it's really all relevant. And they decide how many extra tests you're going to get. They determine how long you get to speak at a school board meeting. You know, these are all, everybody at every level is making decisions. So that's why, like, you know, this is like who you vote for determines all these things that we're talking about today. And so on our website, and I'm so close to the end, is that everyone has a job to do, and depending on who you are, you can click on different parts. So I just put up the next, you know, the parent community member part, which is one, I mean, register. The voter registration deadline to vote in November is October 5th. You know, vote in every election and bring your kids and show them how important it is. You know, talk to your elected officials. They work for you. You picked them, they work for you. You can put them back in office. You cannot put them back in office. Call them, text them, Facebook message them, Twitter message them, email them, go on their Zooms. I know there are a lot of Zooms, but go on there. Thank them when they do something good. I happen to have elected officials who are fantastic for public ed. So while I'm calling other people, I'm calling maybe the lieutenant governor, maybe I'm calling some other leaders, I call my people and I say, thank you. I really appreciate it. We have your back. And then invite other elected officials. I had a friend visit from the Dallas area who had a Tea Party legislator who was not a public ed advocate, and she invited him into her schools in Keller ISD. He met regular people. He heard what was going on. They pulled him out of the Tea Party. He's now a much bigger supporter of public ed. It's really from talking to regular people. Going to candidate forums. I will say this new AISD for All that I'm a part of, it is nonpartisan. We don't endorse, but we're having candidate forums every Thursday night. You can watch them on Zoom, you can watch them on Facebook Live, and then you can sign up for our voter updates. And then this is one thing that I did do that we can give there. Don't send very many. I send a weekly voter update that you can sign up for on the website. And I send them to people who I know want them, but you can sign up there. And I've text election, just reminders, and I send very few. Last day of early, first day of early voting, tomorrow's election day. And you just text Ed Vote to 40649. So really, I mean, advocacy is super important, but it's a lot easier to advocate well if you have voted and picked people who are going to be responsive to what you're going to be advocating for. So I think that's the end of my very, very lengthy outpouring of information.
Thank you, Laura. We have plenty of time for questions. There's a lot of information here. We will certainly be sending this presentation out. Laura, I know, has nothing but free time. So y'all let her know if you want her to come talk to your PTA meetings. There's a number of us on the executive board who can speak to probably most of this by now. But we would love to spread this knowledge throughout the city, make sure it gets to all of our parents and our teachers, because it's ridiculously important. Does anybody have any questions? I know in the chat there's been lots of conversation about the charter schools.
We have a question in chat for Laura. In order to increase education funding, my understanding is that because of the way taxes are set up in Texas, we can't really increase total money coming in easily. Are orgs proposing which other state funding should be reduced in order to increase education? Not sure if that's part of the message to legislators or not.
So it's interesting, from that Texas Tribune thing I watched this morning, they asked Larry Taylor and Dan Huberty what alternative measures. They didn't really talk about taking it away from other things, because our state generally underfunds a lot of important social services. They said what other modes of funding, and they're like, oh, we haven't really thought about that. Now, other people running for election do think about it. I mean, people talk about all sorts of there's all sorts of tax loopholes. There's legalizing marijuana. Some people like that. Some people don't like it. It would make a lot of money for public schools. It would talk about getting billions of dollars in federal funding that we are paying into for expanding Medicare, Medicaid. I mix them up. Right. So again, we have a two-legged stool because we don't have an income tax. So we have property tax and we have sales tax, right? But most states have both. And so our property taxes are high because we don't have an income tax. And so we limit how much money there is. And there are other ways to raise some money, but you actually would need to elect people who are willing to raise that money. And right now, our leaders are not interested in doing that.
I will say that we had Representative Israel come to our school this last year, and we asked her specifically, what can we do to increase funding? And she rattled off 5 things. Top of her head, rattled off 5 things. She said, we just have to have the will. There are entrenched powers in Texas who have been entrenched for a very long time, and they're really not interested in making room for public education. And so we really need to elect representatives who are willing, who have the courage to stand up to some of these entrenched interests, especially when you start thinking about, entrenched interests like oil and gas. Not only is it a deep, dark well of money that just seems like unending, that we will always be fighting against, but you look at their role in climate change and you start, wondering, what are the priorities of Texas here? And so I think that we have a responsibility and we have the power to elect people who are really thinking about us first and how to take care of our children, number one. Because I feel this so strongly. This state, we're in an abusive relationship. This feels abusive to me. And I think we as grown adults need to stop. We need to protect our children and our teachers. It's the single most important thing that we have moving into the future, is a well-educated population of healthy, whole, happy children.
Can I add one thing to that, Daphne? Because it's so true. I will say our elected officials are used to Texans not engaging.
Right.
The Annette Strauss Institute found that Texans are the least willing to engage in political discussions. We are, as I mentioned, almost last in voting. Well, then they can do whatever they want. But when people speak up, part of it is voting and part of it is holding people accountable and saying, look, whether I voted for you or didn't vote for you, you represent me. So I'm going to tell you what I think. The same with our school board. You know what? We have 2 at-large candidates and we have 7 independent districts, but they all vote on everything that affects all of you. So when there's an issue that I'm worked up about, I call all of them. They might be, some of them answer, some of them don't. The ones that don't answer, I don't want to vote for next time. But That's how it works. That's how a democracy works. And that is an issue. And I know there are some charter advocates on the group, and I respect that, but they do not have democratically elected leaders. You cannot call them and tell them you don't like what's happening. It is very different. Our public schools are run by democratically elected school boards, and they are held to how they've used the state funds that others getting state funds are not held to. And I just think that's an important distinction to make as well.